a guest on the show today that's going to talk to us a little bit about something we've been discussing on the show regularly: how to prevent juvenile crime. And one of the big issues there is making sure that there are positive things in these young people's lives from an early age, that they're committed to school, that they're attending school, that they have extracurricular activities, that they're being given the message that you can have a good life. You can achieve things regardless of the color of your skin. The system isn't here to hold you down. We're here to lift you up, and we're going to make sure that you stay connected to healthy endeavors. This segment is brought to you in partnership with our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. So the new King County prosecutor, Lisa Mannion, she launched a program, and it's still at its infancy, I will say. So I think time is going to tell whether this program is successful, but it's called the Safer Schools Strategy, where it involves sort of having a closer working relationship at some of the schools where there have been instances of violence, where there have been students who have been involved in violence outside of school, making sure that there's a closer working relationship between the prosecutor's office and those schools to try to keep schools safer, to make sure schools are a safe environment, which we all want, right? But also to try to make sure that these kids stay on track. And how do we do that? And how do we prevent them from getting to the point where they're serving hard time? So we're joined today by Jamie Kvistad. She is a senior deputy prosecuting attorney with King County, who is one of the leads on the Safer Schools Strategy. Jamie, good morning. Welcome to Undivided.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so detail, before we even get into what your role is and everything that's going on with trying to make sure our schools are a safe place to be, as I think is uncontroversial, what are some of the challenges from a public safety perspective that we're seeing in our schools right now?
One of the big challenges I think we've seen is sort of chronic absenteeism, non-attendance. Children are required, or schools are dropped after 20 absences from enrollment at schools. So oftentimes then these children don't come to school, they're behind, it's hard to locate them, to talk to their families, to assist with re-enrollment. So we really don't want to get into a situation where children aren't attending. We want them to be attending regularly. We want them to feel safe to attend school, and we want it to be a place that they want to be, where they can flourish and sort of attend and get, the educational and protective factors that they receive at school.
Yeah, I guess how does that, what is the nexus there to public safety, the chronic absenteeism versus the public safety issue?
Well, school is a huge protective factor for children. So when we look at risk factors and we look at protective factors, we know that poor academic performance is a predictor for juvenile delinquency. We know that schools that are poorly organized or poorly run, children, again, are more likely to face risk factors, engage with antisocial peer groups. So again, we really want to bolster our schools. We want to resource them. We want them to be a place that offer lots of extracurricular, lots of support. Children access mental health at schools. That's another huge nexus point where children can achieve mental health. And so again, we know that if our children aren't at school, we know where they are, right? They're not out on the streets during the day connecting with other children who aren't in school. We know that there are adults there that are responsible for them. And we know that their behaviors are being addressed and corrected. Schools are a huge place where children learn to socialize, right? Their social development is fostered and antisocial tendencies are corrected.
Yeah, I mean, we said this on the show last week. If the kid is in school, I know that they're not out getting into any trouble or something. So keeping them in school, keeping them in extracurricular activities, I think you're spot on. That's where we'd rather have kids. So what's the role of the prosecutor's office in all of this?
We really looked sort of at coming out of COVID, some of the challenges that our schools are facing, and we developed this year our Safer School Strategy, which is really a multi-level approach to school safety. So at an individual level, I'm assigned to all of the school safety cases. And that may be as simple as, a child who brings, say, a knife to school versus a child who brings a gun to school versus a serious robbery that occurs at school. And the reason we do that is that I'm then able to talk to the school. I'm able to assist the school with information for threat assessment, for safety planning. I'm able to work with law enforcement on warrants. At more of a district level, we assist with safety forums. We assist with more district-wide threat assessment. One of the things that we've done this year, which is different than what other counties are doing, is that the statute requires notification to schools when a child is convicted of a crime. But we now, when we have a child who is charged with a felony involving a firearm, we are sending the school notification. So we are sending them a copy of the charging document with a summary of the charges so they know the factual circumstances. We are sending them copies of conditions of release. Let's say that child, was released from detention and is out on electronic home monitoring or out on their own personal recognizance. We want the school to know exactly what the conditions are so that, again, we can make sure they're being reinforced at home, at school. And then we're connecting with a juvenile probation counselor or really any other supportive, adults in that child's life. If it's a mentorship program, anyone else who can help us kind of hold that kid responsible, connect with all of the, people involved in that kid's life and share information. So that's something that we started doing. I think we've sent out about 70 of those notifications so far this year. Again, really just trying to sort of foster accountability.
I mean, I got to say, I love all that. I mean, that makes sense, right? It's like, okay, if you've got a kid who committed allegedly a crime with a gun, the school should know about that, especially if they've got friends still at school and social groups, et cetera. I guess I'm curious how you got school districts to buy into that, because we know that there has been some pushback to any sort of law enforcement presence in schools. School resource officers were very controversial, particularly around 2020, 2021. Aren't you a law enforcement presence?
We have a lot of different school districts in King County, and so each district is really composed differently. I have found, though, that all of the districts are very much in agreement about wanting to keep kids safe, right? So it's like a child's not going to attend school if they don't feel safe at school. The law also requires districts to engage in threat assessment. They're required to engage in safety planning. And one of the things that we often see after a tragedy occurs at school is kind of these information silos, right? When people had information, they didn't share that information. And so for us, it's really been about showing up at those meetings, working with the schools, letting them know that we are not asking them to single out kids. We don't want kids excluded. We don't want kids kicked out of school. That's the worst outcome for me, right? When a child is, suspended or expulsed from school for the rest of the school year. No one's got eyes on that kid. We want the school to have this information so that they can determine what the risk level, what the need level is of this child, and that they can really wrap around this kid and support them in school, re-engage them in school. And so I think they've definitely seen that commitment from us. Again, it's really just been about kind of connecting everyone, working with all of the different partners, working with community, working with law enforcement. I really think that that's, the way forward. Considering, I think, all of the challenges that our kids are facing right now. I mean, we're kind of in a unique world, right? We have cell phones, we have social media, we have huge exposure to screens, which we know is challenging for memory, right? It's challenging for learning. And so, I think we ask a lot of our schools, right? We ask them to keep our kids healthy, educate our children, watch our children while we're at work, right? Provide them, flash education, provide them music, art, sports, everything, right? And no one entity can do that alone for a child. I mean, that is about the parents, that's about the volunteers, that's about the community. And for us, it's about also the prosecutor's office, doing our part to make sure that school is safe and feels supported.
Yeah, the Seattle Times last week, we talked about this on the show. They did a story about the spike in juvenile crime. And, we're not talking about just, delinquency or, maybe stealing something from a grocery store. We're talking about like some serious, as in the prosecutor's office, some serious, horrible juvenile crime. And usually the victims are juveniles as well. And one thing the Seattle Times pointed out is that the pandemic and kids being out of school really exacerbated that issue for the reasons you addressed earlier. It's like they're not in classes. So where are they and what are they doing? Have you guys found in doing this work that it has been hard to get some of these kids back in the fold after the pandemic and all that time away from school?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it is really challenging for our children who are very credit deficient and are, going to be looking at being a 20-year-old senior, right? That path may not make sense forward. But the good thing is that we have a lot of other community organizations like Reconnect Opportunity that offer GEDs, they offer credit retrieval, they offer many other paths forward for our kids. So again, there's not a one road for every child, and we recognize that. We really want to find what's appropriate for each child so that they can be engaged. I mean, one of the key sort of facets of behavior modification is that external motivation, say like the court system or the justice system, breeds internal motivation, right? So you do something for a while because you're forced to, right? You have to. But then, you buy in and you realize you're doing it also because it's good for you and it helps you. And so then you have that internal motivation. So, that's the outcome that we really want. That's the outcome that we are looking forward to fostering. When it comes to juvenile crime, our numbers are low compared to 2019. They are higher, though, for violent crime, which, we readily acknowledge. It's one of the reasons we launched our Safer School strategy. We are also working a lot more closely with law enforcement. We have another program we call J-Watch, which is basically sort of like a team's meeting that's available every week for our law enforcement to just jump into. It's a standing meeting. It's staffed by my chief, by my assistant chief, and we are there to offer questions. We offer trainings. We work on case development because we recognize these are really complex, serious crimes that are being committed by our juveniles, and we're very concerned.
Yeah, and or how much of that is there a gang nexus?
I couldn't say specifically as to the numbers. I could say that our Class A felonies are definitely, I think, double what they were in 2019. But specifically, gang statistics, I couldn't tell you.
There is something that we always discuss, which is about early consequences, right? Because I think we can all agree that I would much rather have like a kid disciplined at school than get to the point where you are filing charges against them for a serious violent felony crime. Like, right? We don't want your office involved in juveniles because we don't want juveniles committing crime. So there's this aspect of, okay, how do we prevent them from getting to that point and potentially derailing the rest of their lives? So have you seen in working with the schools any sort of failure in the effort to hold kids accountable early on for things like delinquency and other issues that might be indicators or early indicators of that they're going down the wrong path?
Well, I think it's always challenging to hold, to quote unquote, hold a juvenile accountable, right? Because we know that children are sort of the product of many different systems, right? They're the product of their home life. They're the product of their neighborhood. They're the product of the resources that their family has, of the challenges of the systems that they interact with that may or may not have served them well. So, when we talk about changing kids' behavior, we have much better outcomes when we work with families, right? So a lot of our treatment systems, family functional therapy, multisystemic therapy, there are systems that are their treatment modalities that are going to work with the family. And we also kind of want to support that family. So we don't want to just, we can't, again, children need the support of their parents. They need the support of their home. They need the support of their school. So if we're going to work with kids, we really need to take a multifaceted approach. I think children are 50% more likely to develop depression if their parents do. They're 30% more likely to develop anxiety if their parents have anxiety. So again, I think it's about holding a kid accountable, but it's also sort of like looking at the root problem of what's going on, right? And addressing it as holistically, and you're right, as expediently as we can. We never want to address behavior 6 months after it happens.
Yeah, I think, and just to give you some examples, we went through during the pandemic, that something I think has stuck, like, you can't fail a kid that shows up. So this effort to sort of be more lenient when it comes to grading and disciplinary actions at school and making sure those disciplinary actions are equitable and all of that. And one of my concerns with that has been, okay, if you're teaching these kids early on that like there is no expectation for them, right? There's no bar to meet. I worry that will sort of put in their brain that I can get away with things. And we're seeing this at the criminal justice level as well. I can't tell you how many times we've talked to the prosecutor's office because, there's a juvenile who's been charged or is in court for a first appearance on a violent crime. And the prosecutor's office wants them held on $250,000 bail and a judge cuts them loose. There was just an example this weekend of a juvenile who brought an assault-style rifle to a parade and they're already out of jail. They didn't get any, there was no bail set. So is that, from the prosecutor's office perspective, if you're trying to teach juveniles, like there's consequences for their actions and teach their peers, like don't do that because this is the path you might go down. Has there been a lack of consequence for juveniles in the criminal justice system?
Well, I think it's always hard to look at particular cases. And I think the case that you referred to, I think two of those children are still held in detention. One is on electronic home monitoring. I'll tell you the way unlawful possession of a firearm works for children in Washington is that crime is a felony. It's punishable by up to 30 days of detention. So as you can imagine, that's not a long time. No. And you have to have 4 of those convictions before you're even looking at a JR commitment. And I know you've referenced on your show before the situation at JR, right? And the challenges there. So yes, I mean, I think there are issues in the system that maybe need to be addressed. I do think that the juvenile justice system in King County in particular works to hold kids accountable. Oftentimes, detention is sort of an interrupter, right? It's an interrupter in behavior, kind of a chance to take a kid out of their environment, right? And then address what's going on. Again, is this kid in school? If this kid isn't in school, why? What's going on at home? Is this kid supported at home? Are there behavioral health issues that need to be addressed? So there's a lot of, sort of challenges that we work with. But again, our kids are ultimately always going to return to our community. So our best bet, right, is to support them in our community. I mean, that is our best chance to achieve sort of a long-term change in their behavior. But yes, we have to use the juvenile justice system appropriately when we can.
Yeah, and I'll give the King County Prosecutor's Office credit. I think there were some people concerned when your boss, Lisa Mannion, came in that there would be sort of a more soft on prosecution approach. I don't think that's been the case. And I think people tend to lump the whole criminal justice system together when it comes to where the failure is. But I guess what we've seen is people are being charged with crimes, and it's the breakdowns happening, in front of a judge, or it's happening in the sentencing phase, or it's happening at the juvenile justice phase. And like everyone has to be firing on all cylinders to make sure that the justice system is working. So I guess the takeaway here for people who are worried about the juvenile crime crisis and what you guys are doing in trying to intervene early on at schools, what is going to be the barometer of whether this is a successful program?
I mean, we are going to keep developing our safer schools strategy. I mean, we at the juvenile division are serious about safety. I mean, we are working with law enforcement. We are working with our schools. We're going to continue to develop new strategies to do so. But really, this is also sort of about our communities, about our families, about all of our partners working together. I mean, juvenile crime is not a problem for the justice system, right? It's sort of a problem for all of us. It's a problem for public health, right? It's a problem for schools. It's a problem for families. So we are going to have to look at ways to sort of develop protective factors like schools, resource them, volunteer at them, right? Make sure our kids are engaged and make sure our children really have a path forward. I mean, I think of the challenges that our children face now, like with things like artificial intelligence, right? Like, what does it mean to get a degree, right? What does it mean to graduate from high school? What is your path forward going to be? Are you excited about it? Are you invested in it? Is it something that you see and you are working towards? I mean, these are the things that we need to develop to motivate our children, right? To make them choose the things we want them to choose. So it's really something that we all have to kind of be committed to. We at the prosecutor's office are so far down the road, right? When we get most of these kids charged with violent crimes, you're right. I mean, we are digging ourselves out of a hole at that point. That's not the place to make our intervention. Our interventions should be as early as possible. They should be at the school level when it's appropriate. But again, I mean, we need to be supporting our schools, and we need to be engaged and working towards resourcing our kids as much as possible.
All right. Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Jamie Kvistad, we appreciate your time and your work on this issue. And I agree with you on essentially all of that. Like, let's get kids in school. Let's get kids on a football field, taking out their aggression that way. And let's keep them the heck out of juvenile detention when at all possible. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I found that interview insightful. I'm glad. So there's some things about this I like. There's some things about it I'm very skeptical about. But, having the prosecutor's office let a school know, hey, you have a student who was just charged with a felony gun crime. Like, yeah, glad they're doing that. We ought to be doing that. And you also look at, a friend group. And that helps the school figure out if they choose to utilize that information in the way they should be utilizing it, whether there are other kids who are at risk. Because if you've got a 14-year-old at a school who's involved in a gun crime, chances are they're involved in gangs. Well, who do they hang out at school? What do we know about those kids and what issues they're having? How do we do proactive outreach with parents or with support groups or coaches to get them involved in other things, because we know that they're more susceptible to falling into the gang life, right? Like, this is common sense stuff. I don't like that she can't articulate the numbers on gang involvement. That seems like it would be pretty obvious. I tend to believe that the vast, vast majority of these young people who are using guns to commit crimes are gang members. Like, that just makes a lot of sense. I don't know a lot of other scenarios in which you have a young person like shooting at another young person. You have the one-off kind of instances of like school shootings or something like that, but those are really on an island and they're very, very rare. So usually there's a nexus to gang activity when you're talking about guns. And unless we're willing to be fully honest about that and call it what it is, again, you can't solve a problem that you refuse to properly identify. So let's call it what it is. We have a gang issue on our hands. But 100%, if we want early interventions, keep the kids in freaking schools, don't take them out for 2 years during the pandemic. We've already covered that. That had a lot of negative consequences. Get them on a football field, get them in extra. It doesn't even have to be an athletic program. Man, I was in speech and debate. Get them in speech and debate. And what do we always say? Message from the top down, whether it's politicians, the teachers, community members they trust, that you have a bright future ahead of you. Regardless of the color of your skin, your economic situation at home, you can be anything that you want to be in the United States of America. You just have to apply yourself and you have to find something that you're passionate about to put your energy into. That's the message we should be giving these kids. Not that society is going to hold them down and there's nothing they can do about it. All right, that segment is brought to you in partnership with our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org.